What?
Oh, Austria is very similar in a lot of ways. They're not a post-communist country, but unlike Germany, which took full responsibility, there was this immediate post-war idea of Austria as the first victim of Nazism, right? There are still remembrance of the local SS guys at the cemetery and that kind of thing going on. Less of the kind of rigorous denazification that occurred in Germany. Much less emphasis on the Holocaust past. You also have to remember that Austria was and still is a rather divided left-right society, with Vienna being more left and they having one attitude towards things, and the Austrian countryside having another attitude towards things. But there are many things that are actually, and I read some of the stuff. There was an excellent article in Austrian History Yearbook, maybe 2-3 years ago. I just forgot her name who wrote it. Excellent discussion of how Austria is beginning now more and more to grasp with it. And I should say, when you bring up Austria, what about France? What a huge battle France had to go through to understand its own history during the Holocaust. The authors who first wrote about this, like Robert Paxton, and the name escapes me, they were just attacked in French society, and you can see the kind of changes in the way the French looked at this. And by the way, the French had a very small, relatively small percentage of their Jews by comparison to other countries actually murdered, and thousands of Jews saved by individual priests or monasteries. Anyways, but in 1955, there was a film called Night in Fog, and it's usually considered the first Holocaust film. But they don't actually, except for one time in passing, mention the word Jew, and they never show any they never mention anything about French involvement. So, it is a film in which, but they show the actual visuals do have Jews. You can sometimes see their armbands, and you can see them being rounded up in Veldiv, which was like a bicycle racing stadium in Paris. And but when this film came out in 1955, and it's a brilliant film. You get the impression that it was the German fascists and the resistant French population. And it was this resistant French population which was dying in all these camps, these piles of bodies. And what's also interesting about it, when the film was first made, they had a picture, one picture, in which you could see a French policeman and recognizable by his cap. And that was excised at the express request of the French government. That was 1955. Then, just a couple of years ago, came this film, Sarah's Key. And in that one, it's all about what the French did. They show the Veldiv, and it's all about French complicity in the Holocaust. So these kind of battles, now East Europeans and post-communist Europeans are fighting this, and they're working it out. But for everybody, it's been difficult. For the Americans, the easiest, because they're not responsible. They weren't there. Yes. Oh, I see it.
Yes. So I have a question. You gave us a deep sense for the remembrance of the Holocaust today in Eastern Europe, and you also gave us an explanation, I think, by the different factors from 1 to 7 that you explored. Now we can learn a lot about explanations by comparison, and you engaged in comparison, but really only by contrasting Eastern Europe with, say, the United States, for example, a country with a very different history vis-à-vis the Holocaust, obviously. We can also learn, of course, from variation within Eastern Europe, but you didn't go into that very much. You mentioned that Poland today shows a very different pattern of dealing with the Holocaust. And I would like, if you would, to hear a little more about a comparative perspective within Eastern Europe, be it only between Poland and other East European countries. What is it that accounts for the difference between the way in which Poland today deals with the Holocaust as opposed to other countries? Maybe there would be interesting differences, say, between Slovakia and Czech Republic also, but if you would maybe just pick this one, maybe starkest
What
difference.
makes Poland different?
Yes, what is it about Poland?
Well, in many ways it shouldn't seem to be the case, because as I said at one time, the Jewish population goes down between like 3,000 to 5,000. But one thing, Poland was always culturally more liberal, in many ways different from the other communist states. You know, it was never collectivized. It was given a lot of local leeway, particularly in the arts and film in particular. And already people like Alexander Ford and the young Vaida were dealing with Holocaust themes. It is one of the few places where, even under the communists, there was an actual Holocaust memorial for the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. It was also a place where, although there were few Jews, there were a number of powerful Jews in the Communist Party after the war, survivors. But it was also a place that had a Jewish institution, the Jewish Historical Institute. I don't know what other East European country had that. So that, I think, accounts for a certain degree of their liberality on this issue. It's also, geez, this is going to sound bad, but it is a fairly sophisticated, intellectually sophisticated society. It's got a very good sociologists, historians. When I was a young man in the 1970s and in the 80s, I mainly read Polish historians because they were caught between the Marxists, on the one hand, what they're supposed to be, and the French and European trends, which they studied in depth. And so you just got a much higher level of historiography than I saw in East European studies elsewhere. So I loved reading Polish scholarship. It was always on a high level, even in the 1970s. Cultural production as well. Polish film is really high. Polish musicians have been. It's a society with a large number of intelligentsia. So I think that this plays into it. But there's countervailing tendencies, but there's a strong sort of more liberal tendency. So like within the Polish Catholic Church, there are what Joanna, my co-author, calls the closed church. And they are antagonistic to the particularity of Jewish memory. They're the kind of people who want to have crosses on Auschwitz, and feel that the Jews are exaggerating their claims. But on the other hand, there's also a very much more liberal and reaching out kind of church, represented by the more liberal aspects of John Paul II. So the church and the Polish Catholic intelligentsia was one of the few outlets of liberal thought in Poland during the communist period. They had the periodical Znak, the periodical Games, the Tygodnik Katolicki. They had these kind of organs where things were discussed. And much of the, let's say, the core and Solidarność came out of that sort of more liberal wing of the church and the liberal wing of the Poles. You have very influential newspaper like Gazeta Wyborcza, run by Adam Michnik, who is himself of sort of Jewish communist origin, but repented for the sins of his father, right? And he has a certain policy, and that policy is that Poles should own up to what they did, and that others, for instance, he doesn't like to emphasize the organization of Ukrainian nationalists or the Ukrainian insurgent army and its murder of the Polish population. So he's got a population of kind of, Poland should be sensitive to what it did wrong, not to others. And this is a very powerful trend in Polish society. There are countervailing trends. And like that young group of historians, Bogdan Musiał, Marek Janukiewicz, and several others, they crystallize around a much more conservative Catholic a way of looking at the world. And what really crystallized things in Poland was the publication first of Neighbors by Jan Gross, but then his Fear and his Golden Harvest. And these have been debated in the press, openly debated, and people draw their conclusions whether they think they're right or not. While, let's say, in Ukraine, which I know intimately because it's my main area of specialty, there was one debate in the Ukrainian journal, and all the rest has occurred elsewhere. But it also had a much more primitive scholarship, Soviet Orthodoxy, not much of a film industry, no liberal trends in their history, etc. So, and when you mention the Czechs and Slovaks, that's another example which can be used in we Czechs not complicit in this. We were an occupied people. We had a Czech resistance. The Slovaks had a fascist state. So, and I would say that the more Poland is really exceptional. It's on the avant-garde of trying to work on its problems from the past. I can't call on anyone because
I would just put.
Use the microphone.
So that microphone.
there's also hands up there.
Okay. Something came to mind when you were talking about the memorial museum in Washington D.C. And the fact, how memorialization of the Holocaust is dealt with differently here than it is in Canada. Because in Canada they actually have a memorial to I forget the name of the ship. I think it was the SS Lewis. It was the ship of Jews that tried to come here in 1939 that the U.S. and Canada turned away and sent them back to Europe. We don't have that narrative here. We do take a guiltless narrative of like we had nothing to do with what happened over there. But in a way, the anti-Semitism was here. You don't think that had anything to do with our complicity of not getting involved necessarily, or not taking more Jews from those countries or turning them away? I question the and I think you said yourself that whether we're overcompensating for something with the memorials that we put up with the Holocaust in terms of the U.S.'s role. I mean, we weren't in Europe, but we certainly knew what was going on. So, I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Well, I think it's just a kind of different order of things. The refusal to accept Jewish refugees was before the real mass murders began in 1941. And already by that time it was about war. So I think, there's no question there was anti-Semitism in the United States. I mean, Jewish professors only became part of the landscape in the 1930s in the United States. And in Canada, you probably know that Jewish refugees there's a famous book called None is Too Many, and that comes from a government document wondering how many Jews they should allow. And we also have to remember that Britain, for different reasons, wouldn't accept Jews into Palestine. Those are different levels, I think, than it unfolding in your backyard. Your son has to go and guard the Jews overnight. The dining ware you're using is taken from your neighbor. I think that makes a huge difference. And I should say that these kind of debates. There's this famous debate, you probably know it, about why didn't the Allies bomb Auschwitz when they could have, But these are sort of hardly reach public consciousness. And if you go to the museum in Washington, they do show the Evian Conference and all those other places where Jewish refugees were rejected. But it's not the central point of the museum for sure. And in Canada, we now have what's called the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, which I haven't visited, but much of it is devoted to displays on. But on the other hand, what we don't have, for example, in Canada, is a museum of the subjugation of the Native peoples of Canada.
John Paul, we're going to take one more question.
Okay.
I just was going to ask you a more present-day question. It seems that Europe...
Is that Walter? No.
David, can you...
David Wright has met you at dinner, right?
In any case, I'm just curious. It seems like Europe is making decisions at this point about whether or not to stay together, whether or not to have one currency. Ukraine certainly is having a debate within itself or with Putin about its ties to Europe. To what extent is the current either the lack of memory or the institutional memory of the Holocaust either helping or acting as a deterrent towards Europe being able to really grapple with its own identity in this new Euro environment, and what role is it playing as it's debating whether or not to take on the threat of Putin or any of the other activities that the crisis in the currency and all that have brought out?
Oh, that's a very, very good and interesting question. Now, of course, the issues I'm talking about don't have like a huge impact on events which are have economic and military causes as well. But one of the things that happened is that the expansion of Europe and the European Union into the East is really changing to a certain extent on, I think, the memory of the Second World War and of the Holocaust. And the price of admission to getting into Europe is partially coming to terms with your Holocaust history. And every one of these countries commissioned a very serious scholarly work on the history of the Holocaust in their country, perpetrators, and basically that was their ticket of admission. Now, they're in Europe, and they can think the way they want to think about their past. And I think it's changing. It's undermining a more unified view of Europe. I wouldn't rate it very high as such, but like a country like Hungary, in the present government in Hungary, and the Holocaust is not a big. It doesn't come to our attention right away there, but it's part and parcel of that move to a more rightish turn. That's occurring in Europe, and part of it is losing this sense of having a past that's not immaculate. Like France has fought for this, Germany has dealt with this for a long time, and now these countries have all taken their price. It's one of the things about the scholarship, I should have said it, was that once they'd finished their major studies, very little was done after that. And that's what I think is happening, because it is increasing this kind of more conservative, wartime right kind of attitudes. So that's the end of the questions.
I think we will stop there and want to remind people that there's, to join us at the reception just around the corner, and you can get your own, we can line up for copies of John Paul Himka's book. I also wanted to invite you all to come and join us tomorrow and Friday for the rest of the symposium, which will take place on the other Bankham campus in 1210 Heller Hall. It's a very nice conference room with lovely windows where you can look on downtown Minneapolis, and we will have panels starting at 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning. And tomorrow afternoon there will be a panel on the Ukraine that begins at 4 o'clock for our Thursdays at 4 series for the Institute for Advanced Study, and you'll get a chance to hear Professor Himka again. But for now, please join me in thanking Professor Himka for a really great